Hey everyone, this is Mallory Flowers on behalf of Jennifer Charlton Associates, and we are coming to you live from Washington, D.C., and welcome to our Webinar Wednesday series. Our webinars are held every Wednesday in 2018 at 12 p.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and our speakers range from accountants to attorneys and other industry professionals. The full schedule for the rest of the year is on our website underneath the Webinar tab. In the interest of time, we do not take questions, and our speakers' contact info is posted on the last slide. So if you have any questions, please contact the speaker directly. The recordings are on our website underneath the Archive Webinar tab, as well as on our YouTube channel. All right, and this is just a quick blurb about us. Jennifer Charlton Associates is based in downtown Washington, D.C., and we help both product and service companies with federal contracting. Our clients are domestic and foreign, defense contractors and civilian, and our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles, including the GSA schedule. We can also help you with proposal writing and post-award contract administration. More information about our services and upcoming events can be found on our website. And this is one of our upcoming events that you can find more information on the link on the slide or also on our website. And these will be some sponsors and federal agencies that will be attending. All right, so we're going to go ahead and dig into today's presentation. And Mary Beth Bosco is going to be our speaker today. And the title is Other Transactional Authorities. And Mary Beth, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Sure, and can you advance to the next slide, Mallory, please? So hello, everybody. As Mallory said, I'm Mary Beth Bosco. I am a partner in the Government Contracts Group at Holland and Knight. We have about 1,300 lawyers, mostly in the U.S., also in Latin and Central America, and we've got a robust government contracts practice that covers soup to nuts. Pretty much anything you want, we can do it. But we too have noticed that in the last year or so, we get more and more inquiries about other transactional authority or other transaction agreements or OTAs. We both get inquiries from our clients, and we are also often asked to review OTAs. So today, as an overview of what we'll be speaking about, first we're going to cover the basics of what actually is an OTA, how widely it is used within the government, which agencies are authorized to use OTAs. We'll talk about the award process. We'll also talk about some recent trends, particularly through the National Defense Authorization Acts, or NDAAs. And then we'll talk a little bit about what the risks are with respect to OTAs. Just as a preview, one of the issues that we see with respect to OTAs is that very often neither the government nor the contractor know what to put in the agreement, what is required. And sometimes you can be surprised when you go in and look at your OTA as to what you have actually signed up for. And then we'll conclude with a little bit of a discussion about what are some of the best practices. So Mallory, next slide, please. So here are the basics. An OTA agreement is a binding legal document between the government and a company that is basically not what you normally see. It's not a government contract, grant, or cooperative agreement. Most of the basic federal acquisition regulations and FAR provisions, DFAR provisions, etc., are not found in OTAs. Now, the slide says it's a binding legal document between the government and a company, but you'll also sometimes see OTAs go to, let's say, research labs or universities, other types of organizations. The purpose of the OTAs is that so that the government can reach out and get emerging technologies from companies that don't typically contract with the federal government. It's trying to get, cutting edge technology and also to jumpstart research using resources that typically the government won't see. Can you advance 2 slides, Mallory, please? That's good. So we talk about that these OTAs are between the government and what's called non-traditional contractors. Now, the DoD has a very prescriptive definition of what a non-traditional contractor is. The other agencies that use OTAs are not as defined or not as limited in their definition. According to DoD, an organization is a non-traditional contractor and therefore eligible for an award of an OTA if it is a company that is not currently performing and has not performed within the prior year any contract or subcontract that is subject to full cost accounting standards coverage, or that is in excess of $700,000, and the contractor is required to submit cost and pricing data under the Truth in Negotiations Act. Now, under that definition, it would seem to exclude many government contractors, particularly larger and mid-sized contractors. But DoD will allow what we call traditional contractors to participate in the OTA program under a number of circumstances. One is that the non-traditional contractor is participating to a significant extent. Significant is not defined, but it generally means, doing a large portion of the work or contributing to research, something that is essential to performance of the subject of the OTA. A traditional contractor can also participate in an OTA if it is providing financial or an in-kind contribution, which is typically 1/3 of the value of the OTA. And then there's a catch-all for traditional contractors to participate if the awarding agency determines that exceptional circumstances exist. Next slide, please, Mallory. There is another way for traditional contractors and other organizations to participate in OTAs, and that is to be part of an OTA consortium. These consortia are groups of, they can be contractors, you'll see NGOs in them, labs, universities, you'll see state agencies in them, and they come together and they form a group to work together on a particular subject or a research project. And the agency contracts with the consortium and not with the individual companies. It is a very flexible concept. There is definitely no one size fits all. Even in some cases, the consortia will hire a third-party administrator to administer the the mechanics and the relations between the consortium members themselves. So you are basically looking at 2 agreements when you are talking about a consortium. The first will be the agreement between the consortium itself and the federal government agency. And then there is some kind of agreement either between the consortium members themselves or between the consortium members and a third-party administrator to govern their internal behavior. For example, some consortia require dues to be paid, things about how are decisions made, what happens if a contract is given to one particular member and not the whole consortium. So there are, you can imagine some of these consortia have, 20 different members. So you can just imagine what type of issues may come up between the members. And therefore, those agreements are very, very non-standard and just, specific to the situation at hand. Next slide, please. So the next actually 2 slides are a list of some of the OTA consortium out there. You'll see that, DoD has some, there's a medical technology enterprise consortium, Spectrum is one of the consortium, Vertical Lift, etc. And again, these are therefore groups of companies, universities, state labs, etc., who come together and try and develop new technology around each of these subject areas. Next slide, please. As we said at the beginning, not all agencies have the authority to use OTAs. DoD actually has several types of OTA authority. As you'll see, R&D, prototype, ARPA has an energy OTA. Next slide, please. You've got also Homeland Security, TSA, Transportation, FAA, NASA. These are the agencies that can use OTAs currently. DoD is by far the largest user of OTAs, followed by NASA, but DoD really dominates this space. So to get into the process of how OTAs work, next slide, please. You're all probably familiar with how traditional contracts are awarded. Loosely stated, the agency puts out a solicitation that seeks a product or a service. It then may go back to industry, ask questions, etc., finalize that RFP, ask for bids and proposals by a specific deadline. Sometimes there are negotiations, sometimes not. And then at the end of that process, which can sometimes last a year or more, an award is made, and then typically these days followed by a protest. So that's typically how federal government contracts are awarded. Next slide, Mallory. OTAs are way less process-oriented. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all world out there when it comes to who receives an OTA. The broad outlines of the most typical way that OTAs are awarded is that the agency will issue sort of a commercial solutions opening call or a broad area announcement that defines what it is seeking in broad terms. We are, looking for new technologies to accomplish whatever the mission is. And then contractors who may be interested submit a solution brief or a white paper. That's not what we think of as an RFP submission. It's really a narrative describing what they can do and maybe how long it would take them to do it. And then the awarding agencies sometimes will compete among the white papers and ask for proposals, or they may just select one entity to negotiate with. And again, when they ask for proposals, these are not going to be proposals that you are used to seeing. They're not going to have all the FAR clauses. They're not going to have, those defined schedules. There won't be, what you typically see in terms of pricing and clauses, et cetera. They're very, they're much looser is probably the word I want to use. So then once an award is made, this is really one of the key differences. It's hard to track OTAs. It's hard to track awards of OTAs, although they should be announced in things like Fed Biz Ops, et cetera. And it's very hard to protest. You can't go to GAO, for example, over an OTA award. At least we haven't seen anybody do that yet. Next slide, please. There is a recent case out there where somebody went to the Court of Federal Claims claiming that there was a breach of contract under an OTA agreement. The agency moved to dismiss, saying there's no jurisdiction in the Court of Federal Claims to hear disputes relating to OTAs, but the Court of Federal Claims did say that the court had jurisdiction over disputes. And I think you can reason from that the court would also have jurisdiction over bid protests, because you would allege that there is an implied contract to treat the bidders fairly, and therefore you would get into the Court of Federal Claims under a contract theory. Next slide. In terms of recent trends and how you can keep track of recent trends, other civilian agencies who use OTAs are much less transparent, but the Department of Defense, typically there will be an OTA provision in the National Defense Authorization Act each year. So if you want to keep track of what is going on and what dollars are being allocated and what programs are being emphasized to see if they align with your company's business plan and strengths, you can be pretty sure to be able to find this information in each year's NDAA. So for example, in 2016, the NDAA contained a provision that said that a follow-on contract can be used to bring a prototype to market without any further competition. So the conditions are, if a competitive procedure was used in the initial award of the prototype transaction, and the OTA contractor completed the prototype, it can then receive the follow-on contract and not have to worry about it being competed. So it gives some certainty. It protects the company, and certainly at that point you're not really worried about somebody else getting your intellectual property through a competition. Next slide, please. In 2018, the NDA again stated a preference for using OTA in the execution of science and technology and prototyping programs. So you'll see here that the trend for DoD is to develop prototypes through the use of OTAs. It exempts cost-sharing requirements for nonprofit research institutions, and it also states that expressly that production contracts can be awarded to consortia as opposed to a single contractor. That was a change made in 2018. Next slide. In the 2019, the NDAA that was just signed, it expands further some of the opportunities available. It adds a process to compete the work to field technologies identified in Phase 2 SBIR contracts. So in other words, the SBIR contractor would bring the project, the R&D, and the prototype really up through Phase 2, and then an OTA can be used to compete and award the contract that would bring it closer to market. The NDAA this year also introduced the concept of a defense manufacturing community, which is another type of consortia, and the mission is to strengthen the national security innovation base. So you can apply to DoD to be part of a DMC, and then once you have that designation, you can be awarded OTAs as that defense manufacturing community. I think DoD has, I think, half a year to come up with regulations that would bring this concept to practice. Right now, it's sort of a very vague notion in the statute, and we'll have to watch to see how it plays out. Next slide, please. So we talked in the beginning about, potential pitfalls for OTAs, and they really arise because OTAs are not governed by the FAR, so almost anything of importance has to be negotiated from scratch. We'll cover quickly here IP rights, the audit rights of the government, how you don't have protections under CICA or the CDA, and also the requirement that most often catches OTA awardees by surprise is that some of them make the contractor responsible for complying with the affirmative action provisions. Next slide, please. So for most companies, the rubber hits the road when they talk about their own intellectual property and what rights the government gets versus what rights the contractor retains because it is using government funds. It is not, again, if you're under the FAR or the DFAR construct, you may not like it, but at least there are rules. Here, there really are no rules. So we recommend that you use either the statute or the DFAR as your guide as to the allocation of rights. So obviously, you want to retain title if you can. The government is going to ask for and will get a license right because they're going to want to be able to use the technology. The whole point of this is to get technology to market. And that's the basic push and pull. On the other hand, you also want to make sure that you retain, if you don't get title, that you also retain a right to be able to use and commercialize the technology that you have developed. So, as you're negotiating, the two tips are think about using the DFAR or the Bayh-Dole Act, as you'll see on this slide, as your guide, but also think about what the future needs will be if you want to bring it to commercialization as well. Will you have the rights to be able to change, modify, use the technical data, the computer software, or the invention in a way that allows you to commercialize it? If you can go ahead 2 slides, Mallory. The other thing to remember when you're in an OTA is that the government will still retain an audit authority as long as the agreement is over $5 million. So just because it's an OTA doesn't mean you don't have to keep books and records, and you don't have to worry about an audit. Again, this is a trap area because very often both parties, the government and the contractor, enter into these OTAs without a clear understanding of what the billing procedures are and what the contractor has to show in their invoices and what type of records do they have to keep. And this can come back to, bite the contractor when the government shows up with its audit team. Next. The other showstopper is that OTAs, many of them do require that you conform with the affirmative action plan requirements if you otherwise qualify for those. That means that an OTA recipient will have to have an affirmative action plan, and with that plan comes the duty to track your workforce composition, track your applicants and job offers, take remedial action if necessary, and submit annual reports. Next slide. Just to sum up, these agreements are increasing in importance as a source of federal R&D funding. You can really do well if your eyes are open before you enter these agreements, and you can really develop your business or your mission goals in conjunction with the government and avoid the vast bulk of the FAR requirements. But you have to be careful. And with that, I will close and hand this back to Mallory.
Thank you so much, Mary Beth. And for anyone who has questions, please reach out to her here with the information you see on your screen. And at 12:30, we are covering SBA 8A certifications, so please join us then. Thank you, everyone.